Today's film review is being blamed on Kevin Kwan. Candy, who the fuck is Kevin Kwan and how is this his choice? Kevin Kwan is the author of the Crazy Rich Asians trilogy, which you should probably know about me is my favorite book series on the entire planet. I've been through it. I think this is my 4th time. If you haven't read the books, I'm not going to explain it here. There's too much to explain. I do, however, recommend the Crazy Rich Asians movie, which, if I'm not mistaken, he actually did the screenplay for. But moving on. So the big thing for me is that in the movie, Crazy Rich Asians, the bridal party entrance song is Can't Help Falling in Love with You. However, in the book, the bridal party entrance is the Vienna Boys Choir, but the bridal entrance is the theme from Out of Africa, which heavily implies the idea that Out of Africa is a romance. And until today, I have never seen it. But every time I go through this series, I'm usually influenced by at least something in the series. And this time, I wanted to know what the theme from Out of Africa sounded like. So I watched the movie, and that's how we got here. So I will fully admit that the score for Out of Africa is gorgeous. 99% of this movie is fucking stunning to look at and listen to. However, this is a love story in the same way that Knights of Rodanthe is a love story, or basically anything Nicholas Sparks writes. And given everything else in it, I don't think this is something I would want associated with my wedding. But I digress. That being said, I am also the person who thought it was extraordinarily funny to play the Rains of Castmere right before the ceremony started at my own wedding, so do with that what you will. Anyways, here is Out of Africa, a 1985 film starring Robert Redford and Meryl Streep. Now, I was actually really surprised this was 1985. Like, I knew it had to be, like, a younger-ish movie because it's Meryl Streep. And, like, Robert Redford, he's not that old or wasn't that old, but I thought he was older. Then if you look at this movie, it looks like I'd say very 60s-esque. From what I can see, it's like a lot of old school filming techniques. And then also come to find out this is actually based on a true story. Now up here on the poster on the top it says based on a true story, but the poster I saw for it didn't say that. So based on a true story. Here's the story. So this takes place in turn of the century Kenya from 1913 to what I am guesstimating about roughly the 20s. This is during the heavy colonization period of African countries, particularly Kenya. So there's this lady from Denmark named Karen. She has a lover, but she's also friends with the lover's brother. So she's like, sleeping with Luke Wilson, but she's friends with Owen Wilson. Well, Luke Wilson apparently is a piece of shit, and so she strikes up this deal with Owen Wilson. He's like, well, I don't have any money, but I have a title. And she's like, well, I have money, but I don't have a title, and they want both. So they devise this plan that they're going to move to Kenya because they're starting the colonization process. They're going to open a dairy farm and get married so that she can have the title and he can have some money. Well, he goes on ahead and, makes up house and stuff, and then she leaves Denmark and moves to Kenya. She gets there, and she's been traveling for a long ass time. This was before airplanes. And then as soon as she gets there, their wedding was like an hour later. He's like, yeah, the wedding's in an hour. And she's like, the fuck? But they get married, whatever. And then when she gets there, she's like, where the fuck are the cows? And he's like, well, we're not doing dairy. We're growing coffee. And she's like, that's not what I told my mother. And my mother's the one who put up the money. Well, he's like, well, pretend we changed our mind. But then everybody's telling him, that is not a good fucking spot for coffee. You are too high in elevation for coffee. So now she has this whole, coffee farm that she's responsible for because he decides he's going to run off and do, professional hunting and shit. And also sleeping around. And he tells her, hey, I'm not going to be responsible for this farm, even though he's the one who set up the fucking coffee. But even worse, it's not even her own house and farm and shit that she's responsible for. There's an entire community of Kikuyu people who depend upon her having this land. Because if the farm goes under, then the bank will take the farm and the bank will kick off the Kikuyu people from their own land. So that's another thing on top of all that. While all that's going on, she makes friends with a man named Berkeley and a man named Denny, who they're hunters, but they're also part of the ivory trade. Remember, this is 1913. That was still a thing, though. And she makes friends with them. And then finally, we get a little bit of, a coffee harvest coming in to the point they were able to make, a roasting factory or whatever it is. They're doing okay, but it comes and goes in spurts. Well, then World War I happens. And her weird husband thing goes off to war. Doesn't know when he's coming back. Not that he's ever there anyway. Well, then he writes and tells her to send some men with like 300 tons of food and like medical supplies and all this other stuff. Well, nobody's there to like do that. So it's her, some cattle, the supplies, and a bunch of the Kikuyu men travel across to somewhere to bring them supplies. And she's a woman. For her to do all this, for her to go from, her home all the way to the fucking war zone was a super big deal. To which she got lost along the way, and then Berkeley and Denny found him, and Denny gave her a compass so that she could find her way back. Well, anyway, she gets there and she spends the night with her weird husband, and then they have sex, and he gave her syphilis, which, this is the turn of the century, and the only thing they have to treat syphilis is arsenic. So she has to go all the way home to Denmark for a long time to get better. But she gets to come back, and their situation's all weird, but business as always. Well, at the New Year's Eve party, she starts dancing with Denny, and he done ran off with some girl in the back of their car, to which he left her panties, or bloomers, because they're probably ginormous in this time period, in the back of the car, and she's like, okay, you gotta move out in fucking town. You are not allowed in my house anymore. You don't do shit anyway. And also because of the syphilis, she can't have children, and then she starts a school for the Kikuyus, and it's business as always, trying to raise a farm that's failing, but then she takes Denny as a lover. And they go on safari trips, and he buys a plane. And then he's like, every time I come here, I have to stay at the little hotel bar thing. What if I move my shit near your house? And she's like, so you'd be coming and going from my house? And he's like, well, yeah. And she's like, okay. And so her weird husband thing shows up one day, and he's like, I want to marry this woman with money. Can we get a divorce? And she's like, okay, I guess. And then, Denny's back in town, and she's like, so I have to get a divorce, but let's get married. And he's like, but I don't want to get married. I want to be free. Why do we have to tell people that we're married? I'm not going to love you any different because we're married. And she's like, well, I wait on you all the time. I miss you all the time. A little commitment would be nice. And he's like, why do we need that? And she's like, okay, you got to get the fuck out of my house. And then the farm. They finally have a good harvest in the farm. The best harvest they've had since they fucking planted the coffee, which, like, after the first harvest of coffee, I'm gonna tell you, I would have rather reallocated my sources to a crop I knew was gonna grow. We got lucky as fuck the first time we did coffee, but maybe let's not stretch that. Probably could have used that money to finally get you dairy cows, but whatever. They finally get their best harvest, and the roaster house, storehouse, whatever it is, catches on fire and ruins the entire crop. And apparently she didn't buy insurance because insurance is for pessimists. So now she's bankrupt as shit, and she has to go home to Denmark. And she sells everything, and she gets on her knees and begs the new governor just to make sure the Kikuyu people have a place to go because the bank is going to kick them off the land. And Robert Redford comes back for one more day asking to take her to Mombasa so that she can get on the boat to go home. I'm sorry, 2 days, because the first day he had to go somewhere, and then he was going to come back that night, and then he was going to fly her in his plane to Mombasa. Except he dies in a plane crash on the way. And then they bury him on the hill that they had their picnic, and she said if she's ever eaten by something, bury her remains on the said same hill. And then she leaves because she's bankrupt and never comes back. But this whole movie was her telling the story. The end. Did I like it? I don't know what we learned here, but we did have some adventures, although not in the most ethical way possible. Also, I give Knights of Rodanthe like a super low score. Well, I haven't scored it on here, but I have seen it before, and I was really disappointed on it for the same exact reason. But it is, in fact, gorgeous to look at, and from what I could tell in the credits, it looks like they did actually shoot this in Kenya. Now, as to how culturally and or historically accurate anything is, I could not tell you. I did not look into it. Also, it's like 2.5 hours long. It is really, really, really long. It was far from the worst thing I've ever seen. And because it's a true story, technically, I should make it unrateable. However, I had to sit through 2.5 hours, therefore it is getting a rating. And I'm going to give it like a 7 out of 10. 7.5 out of 10. Yes, 7.5 out of 10. You would think Robert Redford would be in my taste of men, but surprisingly not. 7.5 out of 10. Okay, bye.